Serous membranes. So the body is divided in several fluid-filled cavities containing specific organs. All right, and these cavities are surrounded by what are called serous membranes. Serous membranes are 2 layers, and they have a fluid between them. Now, why in the world would you want 2 membranes with fluid around the lungs? You know, wouldn't the fluid weigh them down or anything like that? Well, actually, the interesting part is that one part of this membrane can attach to the body wall, and the other part can be next to the organ. And you'll notice that, and the one thing you need to notice is that serous membranes are around organs that move. So the lungs, the heart, the small intestine, the large intestine. Small intestine is always moving, squishing the stuff that you're digesting down the long 20-some odd foot tube. The large intestine, same thing, it's moving also. Heart's always moving. Lungs are moving in and out, right? So these things are all moving. Well, why would you want this membrane around these guys if they're moving? Well, what happens is you have these 2 layers. So rub your hands together, and you can feel that heat. Okay? So now just think, if your heart was moving against and rubbing against the body wall constantly, it would heat up. It would rub off cells. Cells would have a hard time surviving. It would be filled in with scar tissue eventually, and the heart would eventually stop working. And it wouldn't last very long. So it reduces friction. So it reduces that heat, that buildup of heat, that buildup of which would eventually turn into probably scar tissue. It surrounds organs that have movement. So we have this. What you have is a layer attaches pretty much to the body wall, and the other layer attaches to the organ. The layer that attaches to the organ, let's say this is the heart over here, so the layer that attaches to the heart would be called the visceral layer, and the layer that's out here, outside that layer, it's called the parietal layer, and in between those is a little bit of fluid. So if you take a plastic bag, we'll do this in lab, take a plastic bag, put a little bit of water in there, and rub the walls of it back and forth, it moves fairly easily back and forth. But if you take a dry plastic bag and take those 2 layers and try to move them back and forth, they're kind of sticky. It's hard to move them back and forth, right? So that's what the fluid does between those layers. It's not a very thick fluid. It's fairly thin fluid, and so but it allows those membranes to slide back and forth. So as the heart beats, that other membrane can slide against the visceral layer. The parietal layer can slide against the visceral layer, and the heart can move, and it doesn't build up a lot of friction. Okay, next slide. So this is a simplified diagram showing what a serous membrane is and does. Talking about the viscera, which are the organs of the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. So the serous membrane is the thin, slippery membrane covering the viscera. Okay, you have the parietal layer. Pariet meaning wall, and the visceral layer, viscus meaning organ, Latin. So the visceral layer covers the viscera, the organs within the cavity. The parietal layer lines the walls of the cavity. So in this simplified diagram, you have the parietal layer is here. Okay, that's parietal layer here, and then we have the visceral layer here. Okay, that's surrounding the organ, which is this guy here. So this is the organ. There's another organ. So you have this membrane that wraps around the organ, and then you have the cavity that's filled with serous fluid. So we have this the parietal layer is against the body wall. The visceral layer wraps around. In this case, think of it as you're looking at a cross section through small intestine going this way and this way and this way, okay? And so take a cross section through it. So you have this serous membrane wrapping around this little section of small intestine, hanging off the body wall. And so the part that's attached to the body wall is the parietal layer. The part that's around the small intestine is the visceral layer. So the small intestine can move inside this, okay? And so the serous fluid allows it to move around inside there without producing any friction against the body wall. So this is a very simplified diagram of a serous membrane. We're going to go a little more complicated in a second here. All right, next slide. The other serous membranes are the pericardium. It's makes the going around the heart, makes the pericardial cavity, and there's the pleural membranes or the pleura, which is plural. So meaning plural means multiple, okay? And plural sounds the same, meaning lungs. The pleura. The serous membrane has an E in it. Serous membrane surrounding the pleural cavities, the lungs. All right. Pleura meaning side of the body. Let's see. The heart meaning pericardium. Cardio meaning heart. Peri meaning around. Peritoneum. Peri meaning around. Tonus meaning stretched. So peritoneum is stretched around all these abdominal organs. Okay. All right. Next slide. So here's the pericardial membrane. Here's how it works. So you have the pericardial membrane, the pericardial cavity here. And so this is, here you've got a round ball, right? And then let's shove the heart into this round ball. So this ball like goes and like wraps around the heart, okay? And so this is sort of a cross section through here. It's kind of a cross section through the pericardial thing. So you have the parietal layer. This would be parietal. And this would be the visceral layer. There. All right. And then this would be inside is the serous fluid between those two layers of the membrane. Okay. All right. So you have the serous fluid, so it's allowing the heart to beat inside there. And then there's another layer. It's outside. It's helping hold the whole structure in place. The inside layer allows it to move against that outside layer with a little bit of fluid out there. All right, so next slide. Okay, there's a little bit more to the serous membrane around the heart. You don't have to know this for the test, but I thought you ought to hear this. The pericardium doesn't have just two layers, it actually has three layers. There's the fibrous pericardium, the parietal pericardium, and the visceral pericardium. So the pericardium actually has a tougher fibrous layer on the outside. And the inside, that's the parietal pericardium. Then inside is the visceral pericardium right next to the heart, allowing it to move back and forth. So the pericardial fluid then is between, just as always, between the parietal and the visceral layers of the serous membrane. All right, next slide. In the pleural membrane, the serous membrane around the lungs, you have the two layers. You have the parietal pleura here and the visceral pleura down there next. So that's going to fold over next to the lungs, and the parietal pleura folds over, and between these two would be the serous fluid. Right? Okay, next slide. So here's another diagram of the pleural and pericardial serous membranes with a mediastinum. Okay, you notice I think it was rectangle, and so it's misshapen. But here, this dotted line, you can follow it all the way around and show it goes all the way around the heart. It's inside where the lungs are. So you have the pericardial cavity there, and then you have the parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium, and there and there. Then we have the left pleural cavity and the right pleural cavity. Okay, so here's the right side. Here's the left side, right? So we have the left pleural cavity here and the right pleural cavity. So we have the parietal pleura, the visceral pleura, and we have the diaphragm down below that. So you can see all the parts there. All right, next slide. Here's a little more complicated view. This is a midline view, we'll call it. It's actually called a sagittal section. We'll take a look at that. Figure that out here in a few slides. We have the parietal peritoneum, peritoneal cavity, and then we have the visceral peritoneum is there in blue, and so it goes around. So you can see the blue part goes all around all these organs, right? And then the parietal peritoneum is up against the body wall there. So then we have the peritoneal cavity, so we have serous fluid in there. And it looks like there's a whole lot of space there. Like, wow, there's a lot of space. Well, actually, no. They just showing a little bit of this one tube of small intestine. There's a whole bunch of tubes going back and forth, winding around. Large intestine goes up and around and down. Stomach is there. It has a it's longer, so it's all the space is pretty much full. That's what I'm trying to say. There's like 50 milliliters of fluid that's in the peritoneal cavity. So it's really not that much fluid that's there. It looks like there's a ton of fluid there, all that yellow, but there's really not that much there. Okay. Then you can also see there's some things that are infra or subperitoneal. So you have the uterus, urethra, rectum, and the colon when it starts going down comes out of the peritoneum, out of the peritoneal cavity. Also, you see the pancreas is retroperitoneal is behind it, and let's see, I'm not really showing the. I guess maybe that's supposed to be a kidney there. I don't know. So, but there's some blood vessels that are retroperitoneal, and there's kidneys that are retroperitoneal. They didn't show them on the slide really. So, all right. So, but that gives you an idea, looking from a sagittal view, right down the midline here, cutting through the body, what the parietal and visceral peritoneum are. All right. Next slide. Okay. So we've gone through directional terms, regional terms, regions of the body, directions of the body, and we've talked about serous membranes and body cavities. So now let's divide the body up into abdominopelvic regions. So we have, this is figure 1.5 out of your book, divisions of the abdominopelvic cavity. There's two ways of looking at it. You can do a 4 division, or you can do 9 divisions. So the 4 divisions is, so you have 4, so you have quadrants, quad meaning 4. So quadrants, so these are really easy. You have the right upper quadrant, okay? You have the left upper quadrant, you have the left lower quadrant, and you have the right lower quadrant. Really easy. So right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower. Really simple, all right? And notice this starts at the diaphragm. There's the diaphragm right there, okay? So that's the diaphragm. All right. We can also do it in a tic-tac-toe region in 9 divisions. Now the quadrant on the left side here, that's used more often in clinical situations. Use that because like if someone has a right lower quadrant pain, came on very suddenly, and is very severe pain. What's one thing that you think it could be? Yeah, you think of as right lower quadrant, you're thinking appendix, okay? Possibly an ovarian cyst, something like that, but if it's very severe, possibly also with fever, possibly appendix pain. So you can if you have right upper quadrant pain, so up here, you're thinking about it's dull pain, it's not sharp pain. You're probably thinking, well, probably gallbladder, because that's right underneath the liver, right up there in the right upper quadrant. Okay, so you can localize things clinically pretty simply with just using these quadrants. The 9 divisions is used more often in anatomy, and you have these different regions, and it looks like a lot, but it's really not that bad. So you have the gastric region, so you have the epigastric region is up here, that's around the stomach, is up here, and the hypogastric region, so that's down below the stomach kind of stuff, and the umbilical region is where your belly button is, okay? So that's where that is. Then you have the right hypochondriac region, so hypo meaning below, chondria meaning, or chond meaning ribs, so that's just below the ribs. Then the right lumbar region, which is the lower portion of the back, and the right iliac region. The ilium is the part of the pelvis, one of the pelvic bones. That's the upper pelvic bone that you can feel your hip. That's your hip bone that you can feel right on the side there. So you have the right hypochondriac region, the right lumbar region, right iliac region, and the same thing on the left. It's just left hypochondriac, left lumbar, and left iliac region. So those are pretty easy to remember. You can go through those pretty quickly yourself. Just remember right hypochondriac below the ribs, right hypochondriac, right lumbar, right iliac, then left hypochondriac, left lumbar, left iliac, epigastric, umbilical, hypogastric region. Next slide. Here's just another view of the abdominopelvic regions, the tic-tac-toe grid here on this side, and the abdominopelvic quadrants. So you can look at the PowerPoint and take a look at those, and if you want another view of those as to what organs are in what. All right, next slide. Here's another of the tic-tac-toe view, the nine regions view. So the hypochondrium regions here, the lumbar regions, the iliac regions. So you have the right and left iliac region with the hypogastric region, the right and left lumbar region with the umbilical region, and the right and left hypochondriac region with the epigastric region. Sometimes it's easier to remember in rows going down or up, whichever way you want to do it, or you can remember it from right to left, whichever way you want to do it. I tend to think of it as like more as rows going down. So I think of right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, and this would be epigastric. There would be lumbar regions next, so that's left and right lumbar. So umbilical, I know that's right in the middle. My bell button's right there, and then we have iliac region. Oh, that's my hip bones down there, and then hypogastric. That's down below the stomach region. All right. So next slide. And you get to label these in your lab manual. So you can do both the 9 regions as well as the 4 regions, so you know each of those. All right, next slide. And here's just another view of it showing the right lower quadrants, left upper and left lower quadrants, and the organs that are in each one of those. So you can see we talked about the appendix, as well as the right ovary in a female, being in the right lower quadrant. So if you had severe pain down there, it could be one of those two things pretty easily. And the majority liver is up here in the right upper quadrant, as well as the gallbladder. So if you have a gallstone or some sort of blockage of the gallbladder, then you might start getting some gallbladder pain in that region. So, all right, next slide. And this is out of, it's off the internet. There's a website, nurses.com or something like that. And this just shows the different types of diseases that might be associated with pain in these different regions. So in the right hypochondriac region, you have the gallstones, possibly stomach ulcer. You might actually feel it on that side. You have pancreatitis here, here, and here. Okay, all the way across, as well as here in the umbilical region. Diverticular disease, you would have it here in the left lumbar region, as well as the left iliac region. So you can see all, and you might also have it here in the hypogastric region down here as well. So pain wouldn't necessarily be confined to one single area. You might have an inguinal hernia down in this region or in this region. So depending on where it is. Groin pain might be on either side or in the middle as well. So you can, with these regions, you define where the pain is and say where it is. Well, that's that pain in the hypogastric region could be pelvic pain, or a urine infection or something like that. All right, so next slide. Okay, so body planes and sections. So we divide the body up into sections because a lot of times this is very useful in radiology. So when you look at x-rays, look at MRIs, look at CT scans, you're going to see, and we'll look at a few of those. I've got a few of those at the end here. We'll look at some of those. So we have the way you divide up the body, you do it with what's called left and right. So you can cut right down the middle and cut me into left and right parts. Okay, so that's a sagittal section. So sagittal divides you side to side. Okay, so it divides right and left. And you have what's called a mid-sagittal section that divides you into equal left and right parts, or a parasagittal section. So that's off-center. So let's say we cut through here, so that would divide me into unequal right and left parts. Then we have a frontal section, or also called coronal section, and that divides you into front and back. Okay, anterior and ventral. So that gives you front and back. So it's a slice right down through there. Or sorry, right down through here, down through the shoulder, and then down. Then it'd be down the side. Okay, transverse section cuts straight across. Okay, so that'd be like a cross section. Okay, so that cuts you from top to bottom. All right, so transverse, top to bottom, frontal, front and back, sagittal, side to side. That's how I remember those. All right, oblique section. That's at any combination of all the rest of these, and so that's at any other angle other than across, up and down, or up and down frontal coronal section. Okay, so if I did a section across this way, that would be an oblique section, and that's useful sometimes. Sometimes you'll use those You're looking for like a small fracture somewhere, a small break in a bone somewhere, and you look at it straight on, you can't see it, but if you turn the foot so that you're getting an oblique angle, sometimes you can see the fracture in the bone, say in the foot or the hand or something like that. All right, in the wrist. Next slide. Okay, so here's what they look like, planes of a section. So here's the different sections. We have the frontal section, okay? So that's going through the, and it's called coronal section because here's the crown, all right? So your crown sits here, this is the crown of your head, so it goes through the crown of the head, straight down like that. Frontal plane. Here's the transverse plane. Here's the sagittal planes. This is mid-sagittal, here's parasagittal, here's an oblique plane, all right? And so there's the four there. So here, and it gets really confusing when you're looking at the brain. That's the one time it gets confusing. So here is, let's look at a, you can't actually see this one because I'm in the way. So if we do the mid-sagittal plane, that's cutting right down the middle of it. The frontal plane is going to look like this here. And then a transverse section is going to look like this. Okay, so frontal section looks like that. It looks like nothing you've ever seen before. Mid-sagittal plane is going to be a section of the brain that you might have seen before. So I'll see if I can get a different picture of that here in a second. Next slide. And directional terms, like the regional terms were different, or directional terms between human animals and other animals are slightly different. Front and back in animals are also dorsal and ventral. So we talk about that. So here's your dorsal fin, right? So your frontal plane is going to separate, in us it separates front from back, but in the fish it's going to separate the dorsal from the ventral, okay? So that would be the back from the belly. The transverse plane is going to go across this way, and the sagittal plane is going to go across straight down the midline, like it does in us, but it's going to look differently when you're thinking about a fish versus us. All right, so next slide. Okay, so here we go with planes of a section. This is a figure out of your book, figure 1-6. So I divided this up into 3 different slides so we could actually take a look at it and actually see what's written on there. So you can follow along in your book. Also, next slide. So here's the top part of that figure. So this is a sagittal section. So it'll be a section in the sagittal plane. So a mid-sagittal section is going right down the middle, and a parasagittal section is off-center, right? So that goes off-center. Mid-sagittal is right down the middle. Okay, so it'll be right, point towards the camera. There you go. So right down the middle. So, and then you turn the body to the side and look at it from the side. So here's what a CT scan or MRI or CT scan would look like of the brain here. Okay, of a whole cranial region really. So, so this would be a mid-sagittal section of the head, showing the various structures of the brain as well as the nasal cavity, the nose, nasal cavity here. You got the chin down there, and all that. So, and here's your. We'll talk about what the brain is. We'll spend quite a bit of time on the nervous system later on in the semester. Next slide. Here's a frontal plane. Okay, so there's a frontal plane. So you can see it goes right through this way. It's also called a coronal plane or coronal section. Right. So this is what it looks like if you cut through your skull right like this and looked at the brain front on. This is what it would look like. And so you have got the skull here, got ears. Let me go to white. So got the ears there and there. Okay. And then you got the brain, and you got some spinal cord down here, all that stuff. So where am I? There it is. So, all right, transverse plane. So this is if you cut straight across the top of your head here, and then you look, so you're basically looking straight down, or actually, technically in imaging, you're looking at it from the feet forward. So you're looking at this from the bottom. Is really how you're looking at this. So you got your eyeballs there and there, okay, and your nose, and then here's the brain there. All right, And then you can also take transverse planes also through the abdominal region, which is very, very commonly done to do CT scans of other things. So, all right, next slide. So here's a human brain section. So what do you think this would be? There's a little quiz that you got. So, and the answer's up there. So do you think it's mid-sagittal, transverse, or frontal section? So the answer is this is a mid-sagittal section. So you're going straight down the middle here. So this is it's a frontal, mid-sagittal, or transverse section. This one would be cutting across like this, so this would be a transverse section. We used to do sheep brains in class, which we'd cut them up and show them, and so it was much easier to see rather than just looking at a picture. It's much harder to see that way. All right, next slide. So is this frontal, mid-sagittal, transverse? This would be a frontal section because you're cutting through this way and looking straight on at the brain that way. So that's a frontal section or coronal section. Next slide.